Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the boarding line immediately. The words cut through the noise of Terminal B so sharply that even the rolling suitcase wheels seemed to slow down for a second. Naomi Brooks turned slowly beneath the cold white airport lights, one hand still wrapped around the strap of her worn leather carry-on. Around her, travelers paused mid-conversation. A toddler stopped crying. Somewhere near Gate 12, a coffee machine hissed while two TSA officers approached with rigid shoulders and tense expressions. Naomi didn't move right away. Her dark brown eyes shifted calmly between the officers, then toward the giant departure screen flickering above the terminal ceiling. Washington, D.C., on time. The officer closest to her adjusted the radio clipped to his vest. We received a report about suspicious behavior, he said carefully, though his tone already carried the weight of assumption. A few feet away, a white woman in an expensive cream-colored coat folded her arms tightly across her chest and avoided eye contact. She had been the one whispering to airport security less than 2 minutes earlier, pointing subtly toward Naomi while pretending to scroll through her phone. Naomi glanced toward her only briefly. She had seen that look before. The look that arrived before the questions, before the judgment, before strangers decided fear was more important than humanity. What kind of suspicious behavior? Naomi asked quietly. Her voice stayed level, controlled, almost gentle. The younger TSA officer shifted awkwardly. Ma'am, we just need you to cooperate. Behind them, passengers had already started pulling out their phones. A man near the charging station lowered his earbuds and stared openly. Someone whispered, "Is it terrorism?" Another voice answered, "I knew something felt off." Naomi inhaled slowly through her nose. The smell of burnt coffee, floor polish, and recycled airport air settled heavily in her chest. She looked down briefly at the little boy standing beside the woman in the cream coat. Only moments earlier, his toy airplane had slipped from his hands and rolled beneath a row of seats. Naomi had bent down, retrieved it carefully, and handed it back with a warm smile. Now the boy stared at her with confusion while his mother pulled him closer protectively. The older TSA officer extended his hand. "Bag, please." Naomi handed over the leather carry-on without resistance. The zipper sounded unusually loud as the officer opened it on the nearby inspection table beneath the fluorescent lights. Inside sat neatly folded clothes, a hardcover book with worn edges, a silver thermos, and a small velvet pouch tucked near the bottom compartment. The younger officer opened the pouch carefully. His expression changed instantly. "Sir," he muttered. He lifted out a heavy military challenge coin engraved with an eagle crest and unfamiliar markings. The terminal seemed to grow quieter. The older officer frowned. "What is that?" Naomi's face revealed nothing. "Something I earned." Before either officer could respond, the younger TSA agent reached deeper into the bag and froze again. This time he pulled out a black encrypted satellite phone with a federal identification seal attached beneath the casing. The officer's entire posture stiffened. Around them, the atmosphere shifted fast. Travelers began backing away instinctively. A woman grabbed her suitcase and moved behind a pillar. Someone near the gate whispered, "Oh my God." The radio on the officer's shoulder suddenly crackled alive with sharp static. Then a voice came through loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Federal agents are en route to Terminal B now. Hold position until arrival." Silence spread through the gate area like ice across water. Naomi stood perfectly still beneath the harsh airport lights while dozens of strangers stared at her as if they were watching danger unfold in real time. But Naomi Brooks didn't look afraid. She only glanced once more toward the departure screen glowing above the terminal before lowering her eyes quietly to the challenge coin resting in the TSA officer's trembling hand. The challenge coin caught the overhead light as the TSA officer turned it carefully between his fingers. His expression shifted from suspicion to uncertainty. Around Gate 12, the silence had become heavy now, thick with nervous whispers and the distant rumble of rolling luggage across polished tile floors. Naomi Brooks remained standing beside the inspection table, shoulders relaxed, hands visible, her calmness almost unsettling against the growing tension surrounding her. The younger officer swallowed hard while staring at the encrypted satellite phone resting inside the open bag. "This is federal issue," he whispered under his breath. The older officer glanced sharply toward Naomi. "Why would you be carrying this?" Naomi looked past him toward the giant glass windows overlooking the runway. Rain had started falling outside, thin silver streaks sliding down the tarmac beneath rows of blinking blue taxiway lights. "Because it belongs to me," she answered quietly. The officer frowned harder at that response. Behind the security barrier, more passengers had gathered near the gate entrance pretending not to stare while openly staring anyway. A teenage boy lifted his phone higher to record. An elderly man shook his head slowly and muttered something about national security. Near the coffee kiosk, the woman in the cream-colored coat tightened her scarf and spoke softly to another traveler beside her. "I told them she was acting strange," she whispered. "People do not carry phones like that unless something is wrong." Naomi heard every word. She simply lowered her eyes briefly and adjusted the sleeve of her charcoal gray jacket. The fabric had begun to wrinkle from travel. 12 hours earlier, she had landed in Atlanta from Denver after weather delays stretched across half the country. She had barely slept. But exhaustion had taught her something years ago. Tired people reacted emotionally. Trained people controlled the room by remaining still. The TSA radio crackled again. "Federal convoy entering airport perimeter now." The younger officer immediately straightened. Across the terminal, 2 airport police officers appeared near the escalators and began moving toward Gate 12 with measured urgency. The atmosphere shifted again. Even the background airport music seemed quieter now beneath the tension vibrating through the terminal. Naomi slowly looked toward the little boy she had helped. Earlier, he still clutched the small toy airplane in his hands, but now he hid halfway behind his mother's coat while staring at Naomi with wide, uncertain eyes. For a moment, something softened in Naomi's expression. Sadness maybe, or recognition. She had seen that same fear before in civilians during overseas evacuations. Fear created stories faster than truth ever could. The older TSA officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, until federal agents arrive, we need you to remain seated." Naomi nodded once without argument and moved toward a row of gray airport seats near the gate windows. Her boots echoed softly against the tile floor. Every pair of eyes followed her. She sat down slowly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights while rain continued tapping against the giant terminal windows behind her. The challenge coin still rested in the officer's palm. He studied the engraved eagle crest again. Beneath it, barely visible under the reflection of the ceiling lights, were 3 words etched into the metal. "Not forgotten unit." The younger TSA officer noticed them too. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at the coin for a long moment before answering. "It means some people never came home." The words landed differently than anyone expected. Not defensive, not angry, just tired. A nearby businessman lowered his phone. The woman in the cream-colored coat shifted uncomfortably. Even the older TSA officer seemed unsure what to say next. Then suddenly, through the rain-streaked terminal windows, black SUVs rolled onto the airport access road outside. Their headlights cut across the wet pavement like blades of white light. The younger officer looked toward the glass and inhaled sharply. "They are here." Inside the terminal, conversations stopped completely. Naomi remained seated beneath the cold airport lights, hands folded calmly in her lap, while the automatic doors at the far end of the concourse slowly opened. The automatic doors slid open with a cold hydraulic hiss, and 3 men in dark suits stepped into Terminal B beneath the reflection of flashing rainwater on the polished floor. Every conversation nearby stopped instantly. The airport police officers near the escalators straightened first, followed by the TSA agents standing beside Naomi's open bag. Even from across the gate area, the energy around the men felt different. Controlled, focused, federal. The lead agent walked slightly ahead of the others, tall, silver-haired, his long black coat still damp from the storm outside. A small identification badge rested near his belt, but nobody needed to read it to understand who he was. The younger TSA officer immediately stepped forward. "Sir, we detained the individual after receiving reports of suspicious behavior and discovering classified communication equipment." The lead agent did not answer right away. His eyes had already moved past the officers and locked onto Naomi Brooks, sitting quietly beside the rain-covered windows. For half a second, the entire terminal seemed suspended in silence. Naomi slowly stood to her feet. The fluorescent lights above reflected softly against the silver strands beginning to show near her temples. Her carry-on still rested open on the inspection table nearby. The challenge coin remained in the older TSA officer's hand. The lead federal agent took 2 slow steps forward. Then suddenly his posture changed completely. His shoulders straightened. His expression hardened with respect instead of suspicion. And right there in the middle of Gate 12, beneath the cold white airport lights and dozens of stunned faces, he raised his hand in a formal salute. "Commander Brooks," he said clearly, "we thought you were already in Washington." A sharp silence crashed through the terminal. The younger TSA officer blinked hard as though his brain had failed to process what he had just witnessed. Behind him, the woman in the cream-colored coat went pale almost instantly. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Naomi returned the salute calmly, though her eyes carried a tiredness that seemed much older than the storm outside. "Flight delays out of Denver," she answered quietly. The lead agent nodded once. "We were informed your secure transport lost contact during the weather diversion." He glanced toward the encrypted satellite phone still resting inside the open bag. "We were preparing contingency response protocols." The older TSA officer looked between them in confusion. "Commander," he repeated slowly. The lead agent finally turned toward the TSA officers surrounding the gate. His expression remained professional, but his voice lowered slightly. "You are speaking to former Joint Intelligence Commander Naomi Brooks." Several passengers visibly reacted to the title. A businessman near the charging station lowered his phone completely now. The teenage boy recording earlier quietly slipped his device back into his hoodie pocket. Near the gate entrance, one woman covered her mouth with her hand. The federal agent continued. "Commander Brooks coordinated extraction operations for civilian and federal personnel overseas for nearly 11 years. His eyes moved briefly toward Naomi before adding softly, "Including my own team." The younger TSA officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we did not know." Naomi glanced toward him gently. That part was obvious. Her tone carried no anger. Somehow that only made the shame in the room heavier. Rain continued sliding down the terminal windows behind her, while distant thunder rolled faintly across the runway outside. The little boy holding the toy airplane stared at Naomi differently now. Not afraid anymore. Curious. The woman beside him looked down toward the floor, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. The lead agent finally noticed the challenge coin still sitting in the TSA officer's hand. His expression shifted the moment he saw it. Carefully, he reached forward and took the coin himself. His thumb brushed slowly across the engraved eagle crest and the words beneath it. "Not forgotten unit." For the first time since entering the terminal, emotion cracked through his controlled expression. "I have not seen one of these in years," he said quietly. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly toward the coin. "There are not many left." The words settled heavily into the silence around them. Then the lead agent looked back toward Naomi with something deeper than professional respect in his face now. Something closer to grief. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "Washington asked us to make certain you arrived safely tonight." Naomi nodded once. But before she could answer, another voice suddenly broke through the silence near the boarding line. "Wait, what exactly is she going to Washington for?" The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Near the boarding line, a middle-aged businessman lowered his newspaper slowly while staring toward Naomi Brooks beneath the fluorescent lights. Nobody else spoke. Even the airport announcements echoing overhead seemed distant now beneath the weight of the silence spreading across Gate 12. The lead federal agent looked toward Naomi first, almost as if asking permission. Naomi's eyes drifted briefly toward the rain outside the terminal windows. The storm had grown heavier now. Water streaked down the glass in long silver lines while runway lights blinked softly through the darkness beyond. For a moment, she looked less like a government commander and more like someone carrying something painfully personal. Finally, the lead agent answered. "She is traveling to receive the Presidential Medal of Valor." The terminal went completely still. A suitcase tipped sideways somewhere near the seating area, but nobody moved to pick it up. The younger TSA officer blinked hard. "The Medal of Valor?" he repeated quietly. The lead agent nodded once. "Awarded tomorrow morning at Arlington." His voice softened slightly before continuing. "Posthumously shared with First Lieutenant Marcus Brooks, United States Marine Corps." Naomi lowered her eyes at the mention of the name. The challenge coin remained in the federal agent's hand, but now he held it more carefully, almost reverently. Across the gate area, Confusion slowly turned into realization. The little boy clutching the toy airplane looked up at his mother. "What does posthumously mean?" he whispered. The woman swallowed hard before answering quietly. "It means after someone dies." Her voice cracked on the final word. Naomi remained perfectly composed, but something changed in her face then. Not weakness, not grief exactly. More like the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long carrying silence by herself. The lead agent continued carefully. Lieutenant Brooks was one of 7 Marines responsible for securing civilian evacuation corridors during the Kabul extraction crisis 3 years ago. The older TSA officer slowly removed his glasses. "Marcus Brooks," he murmured. "That name sounds familiar." The federal agent nodded again. "It should." His eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi. Commander Brooks coordinated emergency extraction routes that night after multiple communications systems collapsed. Rain hammered harder against the terminal windows now, soft thunder rolling beyond the runway lights outside. Naomi's hands folded quietly in front of her while strangers stared at her differently now. Not with suspicion anymore. With shame. With awe. With the uncomfortable realization that they had mistaken dignity for danger. Near the coffee kiosk, the woman in the cream-colored coat looked visibly shaken. Her face had lost nearly all color. She glanced toward Naomi several times before finally speaking in a small voice. I did not know." Naomi looked at her calmly. "No," she answered softly. "You did not." The simplicity of the response landed harder than anger ever could have. The woman lowered her eyes immediately. Nearby, the teenage boy who had been recording earlier quietly deleted the video from his phone. The younger TSA officer shifted nervously beside the inspection table. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we are very sorry for how this was handled." Naomi studied him for a second before answering. Fear makes people react before truth has time to enter the room. Nobody spoke after that. The only sound came from rain tapping against glass and the distant rolling announcement of another departing flight across the terminal. Then the little boy holding the toy airplane slowly stepped away from his mother and walked toward Naomi. Every adult nearby watched nervously. The boy stopped directly in front of her chair and held up the small plastic airplane she had helped him retrieve earlier. "Are you really a soldier?" he asked quietly. Naomi's expression softened for the first time all night. She looked down at the toy plane in his hands, then toward the blinking runway lights outside the terminal windows. "No, baby," she answered gently. "I was the one trying to bring soldiers home." The little boy stared at her for a moment, then slowly held the toy airplane out toward her. "Then I think this belongs to you for a while." For the first time since entering the terminal, Naomi Brooks smiled. Naomi looked down at the small plastic airplane resting in the boy's outstretched hand, and for a moment the noise of the airport seemed to disappear completely. The rain beyond the terminal windows softened into a dull silver blur, while runway lights reflected faintly across the polished floor around Gate 12. Slowly, Naomi accepted the toy airplane with both hands, carefully, almost as if it carried real weight. The little boy smiled shyly. His mother stood several feet behind him now, her arms no longer crossed protectively over her chest. Instead, she looked embarrassed, uncertain, like someone replaying her own assumptions in real time and wishing she could take them back. Naomi turned the tiny airplane over once in her hands. One wing was scratched near the edge. A faded airline sticker peeled slightly near the tail. "This plane has seen some things," she said softly. The boy nodded proudly. "It flies everywhere with me." Naomi smiled faintly again, but the expression disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Across the gate area, passengers had begun lowering their phones entirely now. Some quietly returned to their seats. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The energy inside the terminal had transformed into something awkward and heavy, like an entire room realizing it had participated in something ugly without ever speaking it aloud. The younger TSA officer finally stepped forward again, his face still pale with discomfort. "Commander Brooks," he began carefully, "we truly did not mean to disrespect you." Naomi lifted her eyes toward him. "You thought you were protecting people," she answered calmly. "That matters too." The officer blinked in surprise. "After everything that happened here, you still see it that way?" Naomi looked toward the rain outside the windows again before answering. "Fear changes people." Her fingers brushed lightly against the toy airplane in her hands. "Sometimes fear makes decent people forget how to see each other clearly. The older TSA officer slowly removed his gloves and placed them on the inspection table beside the open bag. My son serves in the Army, he said quietly. 2nd Ranger Battalion. Naomi nodded once with immediate understanding. Then you already know. The man swallowed hard and looked away. He did know. Every parent of someone in uniform knew that same silent fear. The waiting, the late-night phone calls, the constant tension hidden beneath ordinary days. Near the terminal entrance, airport employees had quietly stopped walking through the area entirely. Even they seemed pulled into the strange emotional gravity surrounding Gate 12 now. The lead federal agent glanced toward his watch briefly before stepping closer to Naomi. Ma'am, transportation is prepared whenever you are ready. Naomi nodded politely, but she did not move yet. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the velvet pouch still sitting open beside her bag on the inspection table. The federal agent noticed immediately. Without a word, he retrieved the challenge coin carefully and handed it back to her. Naomi held the coin in her palm for a long moment beneath the fluorescent lights. Her thumb traced slowly across the engraved eagle crest. Not forgotten unit. The little boy tilted his head curiously. Was that your team? He asked. Naomi's expression softened again, though sadness flickered behind it this time. A long time ago. Were they heroes? The boy asked. Naomi looked down at the coin before answering. Some people think heroes are the loudest ones in the room. Her voice remained quiet, steady. But usually the real heroes are just tired people who kept showing up when everybody else ran. The words settled over the gate area gently, but nobody missed their weight. The woman in the cream-colored coat suddenly stepped forward from near the coffee kiosk. Her heels clicked softly against the tile floor as she approached Naomi with visible hesitation. Rainwater shimmered faintly across the terminal windows behind them, while the overhead departure board flickered another update for Washington, D.C. The woman stopped a few feet away, clutching the strap of her purse tightly. Commander Brooks, she began quietly. Naomi lifted her eyes toward her. The woman's voice trembled slightly now. I owe you an apology. The apology seemed to stop the entire terminal from breathing for a moment. Rain continued sliding down the massive airport windows behind Naomi Brooks while the woman in the cream-colored coat stood frozen beneath the fluorescent lights, clutching her purse strap so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Naomi looked at her quietly, the small plastic airplane still resting in one hand, and the challenge coin folded carefully inside the other. Around Gate 12, passengers pretended not to listen while listening to every word. The woman swallowed hard before speaking again. I saw the phone in your bag earlier when you were near the charging station, she admitted softly. And when you kept checking the departure board, I thought. Her voice trailed off beneath the weight of her own embarrassment. Naomi did not rescue her from the sentence. The silence forced the woman to continue. I thought something felt dangerous. Naomi's expression remained calm, but tiredness moved behind her eyes like a shadow. Dangerous, she repeated quietly. The word lingered between them. The woman nodded weakly. I know how terrible that sounds now. Naomi looked down briefly at the toy airplane in her hand before answering. No, she said softly. It sounds familiar. The honesty in the response hit harder than accusation ever could have. The woman's eyes immediately filled with tears she clearly had not expected. Behind her, several passengers lowered their heads uncomfortably. Even the TSA officers avoided looking directly at Naomi now. The younger officer shifted his weight awkwardly beside the inspection table. Commander Brooks, he said carefully, most people in your position would be furious right now. Naomi glanced toward him. Fury is heavy, she answered. I spent too many years carrying heavier things. Nobody spoke after that. The airport seemed strangely quieter than before, despite hundreds of people still moving through distant gates beyond the concourse. Somewhere far down the terminal, a boarding announcement echoed faintly across. Polished floors and glass walls. Naomi slowly walked toward the rain-covered windows overlooking the runway, her boots soft against the tile. The federal agents remained nearby, but gave her space now, almost instinctively. Outside, planes taxied slowly through the storm beneath rows of blinking blue lights. Naomi stopped near the glass and stared at the runway in silence. The little boy's toy airplane rested gently in her hand. Behind her, the lead federal agent lowered his voice toward the TSA officers. Do you know why she never travels with military escort unless absolutely necessary? Both men shook their heads quietly. The federal agent looked toward Naomi, standing by the window, before answering. Because she says uniforms make people forget how to see the human being first. The older TSA officer removed his glasses again and rubbed his eyes tiredly. My God! Near the seating area, the woman in the cream-colored coat finally stepped closer to Naomi again, though much more carefully this time. My husband served overseas, she said softly. Naomi turned slightly toward her. Army. The woman nodded. 2 tours. Naomi studied her face for a brief second, then nodded once with understanding. Then you know what fear does to families. Tears slipped quietly down the woman's cheeks now. Yes, she whispered. Naomi's voice stayed gentle. Fear teaches people to search rooms for threats before they search for humanity. The woman lowered her eyes completely after that. Near the gate entrance, the teenage boy who had recorded the confrontation earlier slowly approached the younger TSA officer, holding out his phone. Sir, he said quietly, I deleted the video. The officer nodded once. Thank you. The teenager glanced toward Naomi, standing near the windows. I thought I was recording something bad happening, he admitted. The officer looked toward Naomi too before answering softly. So did we. The rain outside began easing at last, the heavy storm softening into thin silver mist beneath the runway lights. Naomi remained still beside the giant terminal windows while reflections of moving aircraft shimmered across the glass around her. For a moment, she looked, completely alone despite the crowded terminal surrounding her. Then the lead federal agent stepped beside her quietly. Ma'am, he said carefully. The memorial committee called while we were en route. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the challenge coin. And? She asked softly. The agent hesitated only a second. They want you to deliver the closing speech tomorrow. The words seemed to drain the warmth from the terminal air for a moment. Naomi Brooks remained standing beside the rain-streaked windows while the reflections of departing aircraft moved slowly across the glass behind her. The challenge coin rested quietly in her palm, its edges worn smooth from years of carrying it through places most people would never see. The closing speech, she repeated softly, almost to herself. The lead federal agent nodded. The committee said there is nobody else they trust to do it. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Across Gate 12, passengers listened without pretending not to anymore. Even strangers walking through the concourse had slowed down now, sensing something important unfolding beneath the harsh airport lights. The younger TSA officer glanced toward the older one uneasily. What is the closing speech for? He whispered. The older officer answered before the federal agent could. For the families. His voice came out quieter than before. It is always for the families. Naomi exhaled slowly and slipped the challenge coin back into the velvet pouch. Her fingers lingered there for half a second longer than necessary. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped completely now. The storm clouds were beginning to break apart over the runway, revealing faint strips of dark blue night sky beyond the airport lights. The little boy holding the empty spot where his toy airplane used to be looked up at Naomi carefully. Do you have to talk about your son tomorrow? He asked. Several adults nearby immediately looked uncomfortable at the question, but Naomi did not. She looked down at him with calm understanding. Yes, she answered gently. I think I do. The boy tilted his head. Does it hurt? The entire terminal seemed to hold still, waiting for her answer. Naomi stared out toward the runway for a long moment before speaking. Every day. Nobody moved after that. The woman in the cream-colored coat quietly wiped tears from beneath her eyes. Near the coffee kiosk, a businessman who had once stared suspiciously at Naomi now stood completely still with his newspaper folded beneath one arm, shame written openly across his face. The lead federal agent cleared his throat softly. Lieutenant Brooks saved 34 civilians during the evacuation operation. He said carefully, almost as if he wanted the terminal to understand the full weight of the name they had heard earlier, including 2 children trapped near the Eastern Corridor checkpoint. Naomi's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained silent. The federal agent continued. When communications failed, Commander Brooks coordinated extraction routes manually for nearly 6 straight hours. The younger TSA officer stared at Naomi in disbelief. You were both there? Naomi nodded once. Marcus was 24. Her voice stayed steady, though quieter now. Too young to carry what he carried. The little boy looked down at the toy airplane still resting in Naomi's hands. Was he scared? He asked softly. Naomi's expression shifted then, something deeper moving behind her eyes. Not just grief anymore. Memory. Everybody was scared, she answered honestly. Courage is not about being fearless. Her fingers brushed lightly across the toy airplane wing. It is about choosing to stand beside people anyway. The terminal fell silent again beneath the low hum of airport ventilation and distant rolling announcements. Then suddenly the boarding screen above Gate 12 flickered. Washington, D.C., now boarding priority passengers. Naomi glanced up automatically at the announcement. The federal agent beside her straightened slightly. Your flight is ready, ma'am. Naomi nodded. But before she could move, the older TSA officer stepped forward, holding her carry-on carefully with both hands. His posture had completely changed now. No suspicion, no authority, just respect. Commander Brooks, he said quietly, handing her the bag. Thank you for your patience tonight. Naomi accepted the carry-on gently. Thank you for remembering I was human before I was important. The words struck the gate area harder than anyone expected. The older officer lowered his eyes immediately. Nearby, the woman in the cream-colored coat covered her mouth again as tears slipped down her face. Even the federal agents remained silent after hearing that. Naomi adjusted the strap of the worn leather bag over her shoulder, then looked once more toward the runway lights glowing beyond the terminal glass. Somewhere outside, another aircraft lifted into the night sky, its lights disappearing slowly into the clouds. Then Naomi turned calmly toward the boarding gate, unaware that nearly every person in Terminal B was now watching her for an entirely different reason than before. Naomi Brooks walked slowly toward the boarding lane while the terminal remained unnaturally quiet behind her. The polished tile reflected the pale airport lights beneath her boots, and the soft rolling sound of distant luggage echoed somewhere far across the concourse like background noise from another world. People moved aside instinctively now, creating space for her without being asked. But Naomi did not walk like someone important. She walked like someone tired. The worn leather carry-on rested against her shoulder, while the little plastic airplane remained folded gently in her hand beside the velvet pouch carrying the challenge coin. The lead federal agent stayed several steps behind her, not escorting her exactly, more like walking beside a memory too heavy to leave alone. Near the gate scanner, the airline attendant straightened immediately upon seeing Naomi approach. Commander Brooks, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with recognition now. Naomi offered a small nod. Evening. The attendant glanced briefly toward the federal agents, then back toward Naomi. Ma'am, first class has already been prepared for you. Naomi looked surprised for the first time all night. Prepared. The woman nodded quickly. Washington called ahead after the delay. Naomi exhaled quietly through her nose, almost amused by the idea. Coach was fine. The airline attendant smiled sadly. Maybe, but some people deserve to rest. The sentence landed gently between them. Naomi looked away toward the dark runway outside the terminal windows before answering. Most of the people who deserved rest never made it home. The attendant lowered her eyes immediately after hearing that. Behind Naomi, the younger TSA officer stood near the boarding lane still watching her with visible regret on his face. Finally, he gathered enough courage to step forward one last time. Commander Brooks? Naomi turned calmly toward him. The young officer swallowed hard. Can I ask you something? Naomi nodded once. Why did you stay so calm tonight? The question seemed to catch even the federal agents off guard. Naomi looked at the young man carefully for a few seconds before answering. Because humiliation only wins when it changes who you are. The officer stared at her silently. Naomi's voice remained soft, steady, almost reflective now. I learned a long time ago that anger can protect your pride for a moment. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the terminal around them. But grace protects your soul. Nobody near the gate spoke after that. Even the passengers waiting nearby seemed frozen beneath the fluorescent lights, listening to words that felt bigger than the airport itself. The little boy suddenly broke away from his mother again and ran carefully toward Naomi before stopping beside her leg. Wait, he said quickly. Naomi looked down. The boy pointed toward the toy airplane still in her hand. You can keep it longer. Naomi smiled faintly. Are you sure? The boy nodded seriously. I think your son would have liked planes too. The sentence struck the terminal with breathtaking silence. The mother gasped softly and immediately covered her mouth, but Naomi did not flinch. Her eyes lowered slowly toward the little airplane resting in her palm. For the first time all night, real emotion cracked visibly across her face. Not dramatic grief. Something quieter, deeper. The kind of pain carried so long it becomes part of how someone breathes. Naomi crouched carefully to the boy's eye level. "He loved them," she whispered. The boy smiled softly. "Then you should keep it until you see him again someday." Tears filled the mother's eyes instantly. Even the lead federal agent looked away toward the windows after hearing that. Naomi stayed crouched for one extra second before gently placing her hand against the boy's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. Then she stood again beneath the glowing departure screen, while rainwater continued sliding slowly down the giant terminal windows behind her. Final boarding, Washington, D.C. The airline attendant stepped aside quietly to let her pass. Naomi adjusted the strap of her carry-on one last time and walked toward the jet bridge entrance beneath the pale airport lights. But just before disappearing down the corridor, she stopped and turned slightly back toward the crowded terminal behind her. Hundreds of eyes watched her now, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with something painfully close to understanding. Naomi Brooks stood at the entrance of the jet bridge for one final moment while the entire terminal watched her in silence. The pale airport lights reflected softly against the damp windows behind her, and somewhere beyond the glass, another plane lifted slowly into the night sky above Atlanta. The little plastic airplane still rested in Naomi's hand beside the velvet pouch carrying the challenge coin. Her carry-on hung quietly from one shoulder, worn from years of travel through places most people would never survive seeing. Behind her, Gate 12 remained frozen beneath the strange emotional stillness that had settled over everyone there. The passengers who once stared at her with suspicion now looked at her like they had witnessed something they would carry home with them long after the flight boards changed and the terminal emptied. Naomi slowly turned back toward the people gathered behind the boarding line. Her eyes moved briefly across the TSA officers, the federal agents, the businessman with the folded newspaper, the teenage boy who deleted the video, the woman in the cream-colored coat still wiping tears from her face, and finally the little boy standing quietly beside his mother. Nobody spoke. Naomi looked down at the toy airplane in her hand before lifting her eyes again. "You know," she said softly, "Marcus used to love airports." The words drifted gently through the terminal. The little boy smiled faintly. Naomi's voice remained calm, almost distant now, like someone remembering sunlight from another lifetime. "When he was 8 years old, he used to sit by our apartment window every night counting planes." A tiny smile touched her face. He believed every plane was carrying someone home to people who loved them. The federal agent lowered his head quietly after hearing that. Naomi glanced once toward the dark runway outside the windows. "The night before his deployment, he told me something I still think about every day." Her fingers tightened slightly around the toy airplane wing. He said, "Mom, if I can help even one family make it home together, then it matters." Silence swallowed the gate again. The older TSA officer removed his glasses once more, blinking hard beneath the fluorescent lights. The woman in the cream-colored coat quietly pressed trembling fingers against her lips. Naomi looked back toward the little boy. "So thank you for lending me your plane tonight." The boy nodded solemnly, like he understood the weight of the moment far more than a child should. Naomi stepped closer and gently placed the toy airplane back into his hands. "Take good care of it," she whispered. "It already helped someone get home." The little boy clutched the airplane tightly against his chest. "Yes, ma'am." Naomi smiled one last time. Then she turned back toward the jet bridge entrance. The lead federal agent straightened beside the doorway, and without a single word, he raised his hand once more in a formal salute. This time the older TSA officer followed, then the younger one, then one of the airport police officers near the escalator. Slowly, almost uncertainly at first, several veterans waiting near the terminal seating area stood to their feet as well. One after another, hands rose quietly to foreheads beneath the cold airport lights while Naomi Brooks stood motionless at the entrance to the plane. She looked genuinely startled for the first time all night. Not by authority, not by recognition, but by kindness. Her eyes glistened briefly before she steadied herself again. Naomi returned the salute slowly, carrying all the grace and exhaustion of someone who had spent her life protecting strangers who never knew her name. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared down the jet bridge corridor toward Washington. The terminal remained silent long after she vanished from sight. Outside, rainwater still clung to the runway while blue taxi lights stretched endlessly into the darkness. Near the boarding lane, the younger TSA officer finally looked toward the older one and spoke in a hushed voice. "How do people like her stay so kind after everything?" The older officer watched the empty jet bridge quietly before answering. "Because some people carry honor the way others carry anger." The little boy looked down at the airplane in his hands. "Mom," he whispered softly. "Yeah, baby." He stared toward the empty corridor where Naomi had disappeared. "I hope she makes it home too."